2015 update for North Carolina corn insect pests. Today I'll be covering new corn offerings for insects, including new stack toxins with BTs, seed treatments, and I'll also be covering stink bug management in corn. First off, I want to talk about these new stacked BT toxin varieties. I think it's important to keep in mind what we're targeting with our BTs. We do have some occasional mid to late season lepidopteran pests, things like cutworm and armyworms. The borers used to be huge pests in our area, things like southern cornstalk borer, European corn borer, but single toxin protein BTs have almost eliminated these from our system. So really what we're targeting now is our common mid to late season lepidopteran pest, which is corn earworm. This is a list that's not exclusive, but it's for products that are generally available in our area. And you can see that there's a number of different trade names that these products go by, and that these products contain different BT proteins. Now I've highlighted the ones in black that are targeting our lepidopteran pests, and unless we're growing corn on corn situations for silage, we can essentially ignore the traits that are grayed out there, since those are targeting corn rootworm. Draw your attention to the column on the right, and you'll see the relative efficacies for corn earworm and fall armyworm. Now these ratings are for both corn earworm in the ear and fall armyworm as a whorl pest. And you notice that there's a range of different efficacies for these products. These are the products that I think you're most likely to plant. Notice that these are exclusively multi-toxin products. So we're seeing the single toxin products being eliminated from the commercial offerings. And in terms of efficacy against these two main pests that we have, this is a good thing. Most of these stack up in the excellent, and for a few of them they're in the fair to good area. Here are the new products that are going to be offered. You notice that these are 3 toxin products, and for corn earworm and fall armyworm, they're either very good or excellent in terms of control. I think it's important to keep in mind the fact that even though we're controlling these insect pests, in most situations we may actually not need to control these insect pests. This graph demonstrates an experiment that was done in North and South Carolina, both in 2012 and 2013. And I understand it's a little bit of a funky thing in milligrams per hectares, but that's yield. And then we have kernel injury per ear. And if there were a relationship between ear feeding and yield, we would expect it to look something like this. That is to say, as the injury increased, we would expect the yield to decrease. But we typically don't see that in our normal planting situations. So I think it's important to keep in mind that even though these toxins are going to control something like corn earworm in the ear, in typical situations, we generally aren't seeing a boost in yield as a result of that control. Now there are benefits in terms of possibly decreasing aflatoxins, probably need to control it in late planted corn, may be important in droughty years, but in most situations it's not providing us a yield benefit. Where I do think it can provide some of the most benefit are in whorl stage infestations. This is a picture of fall armyworm injury on whorl stage corn. Looks pretty bad. This was an experiment done at the Vernon James Research Center in 2014. I want to be clear that this was an artificial infestation, but it mimics what we see generally naturally in the field. One thing that we do is we take injury ratings. This is done on a 0 to 9 scale, with 0 being little injury and 9 being lots of injury. On the left of the blue bar you see non-BT corn, and in the right on the red bar you see Smart Stacks corn. And you notice that we significantly decreased injury from fall armyworm using the Smart Stacks corn. Very few of the plants in the field were actually injured though in the non-BT corn, around 14%. And I think this mimics our natural situations quite readily. Typically when you walk in a cornfield, your eye is drawn to the worst spots. You see the spots like those pictured on the right, although most of the plants are not injured. And because of that, we typically see no increase in yield due to our BT traits. Now there are situations where we do have heavy whorl stage infestations and we can expect those yield decreases, and those are the cases where BT corn with the multiple stack proteins is going to pay off. Without exception, these traits are very good and they do the job they're supposed to. Here are a number of different offerings that you can receive on the seed. Most of these are neonicotinoid class insecticides, clothianidin, thiamethoxam, and imidacloprid. We do have one that is a non-neonicotinoid, permethrin, that's available. In addition, we have a new product available this year, and it's a combination of a neonicotinoid, thiamethoxam, and an insecticide called chlorantraniliprole. Now, this is not in the neonicotinoid class of chemistry. Being from a different class of chemistry, it targets different modes of action, and it can provide a resistance management tool because we're rotating chemistries. In addition, for our most common pests that we target in North Carolina, things like billbugs, white grubs, and wireworms, it seems to be comparable to some of our available products. Here are some data that were generated in 2014 from Hyde County. You notice our untreated corn here on the left, and the commercially available product, which is Lumivia, at the 250 rate plus Cruiser 250. And you notice that it's providing comparable control to our commercially available standard for billbug. Now, I want to be clear that this infestation was a relatively low infestation. In this planting, I planted at 2 seeds per row foot, and notice that in my untreated plots I was bumping up against only 0.07 injured plants per row foot. So I think under sort of normal low pressure situations, this product is going to be very excellent. I think it remains to be seen how well it's going to hold up against high pressure situations. I want to transition now just to talk a little bit about billbug biology, because I think it's important to keep in mind when we see what we may consider product control failures or when we analyze effects of these products in the field. This is typically where you're going to see the billbug throughout the year. It overwinters as an adult, and when corn is planted in early spring, typically in April and May, it moves as an adult by crawling into the field, although they can fly, and it feeds on the base of the plant. Now, in addition to creating injury by feeding, it also inserts its abdomen into that plant and lays an egg in there. And that's where the billbug larvae develops. This is the injury that we're trying to avoid from billbug, and this results directly from the feeding. What they're doing is they're actually disrupting some of the growing points of the plant, and they can stunt it, sometimes kill the plant, and create foliage loss. Later on in the season, when the plants get bigger, sometimes it tries to outgrow that injury. And remember that the billbug has killed parts of the growing points of the plant, so we can see severe deformations and abnormalities in terms of growth. And sometimes it can even turn plants in the field into essentially weeds, where they're not going to put up a reproductive structure, and they're just taking away from nutrients from other plants that are undamaged in the field. Later on in the season, we can actually see lodging in the plants due to the billbug developing. Now, remember earlier I said that billbug adult was laying an egg at the base of the plant. That egg develops into a larvae that develops in that plant base, and because the larvae is developing in there and feeding on that plant, it's weakening the plant, weakening the root system, and lodging can result as an effect. We saw this to some degree in Hyde County last year, and in fact some growers even described to me finding billbug larvae in the bin of their combine after they harvested the corn. What I think happened here was probably the plant was so weak that some of that plant was taken up into the head, and the larvae itself was taken through the combine and up into the grain bin. One thing that I've been curious to know is, can we boost efficacy with in-furrow insecticides? Now, we have a student working on this project in addition to a number of different objectives, and what he did was he planted a number of different treatments in different locations targeting different insect pests. One pest that he targeted was wireworms, and what we have set up in this treatment here is corn without an insecticidal seed treatment, corn with capture, which is bifenthrin, a pyrethroid in furrow, corn with counter or turbophos, which is an organophosphate in furrow, and then our insecticidal seed treatments, Poncho 500 and Poncho 1250 with counter at 8 ounces, seeing if we could boost these insecticides with in-furrow applications. And at least in terms of wireworms, when we look at the average number of wireworms, these are actually wireworms on the roots of the plants, it seems like the answer is no. The number of wireworms seem to be the same with or without the addition of capture and furrow. These data are also from Pasquotank County, a different location, And the insects present at this site were both wireworms, but also annual white grubs. And what annual white grubs do is they feed on the roots of the plants, and they can actually decrease the root mass. And so that's what we're looking at here, is the root mass of the plant. And you can see that with the addition of the counter and furrow, we were not able to increase the root mass of the plant compared to the seed treatment alone. So it seems like these in-furrow insecticides are not providing an additional benefit to the seed treatment. And finally, when we look at bill bugs, average number of injured plants per row foot, the answer is much the same. With the addition of the granular insecticide counter and furrow, we did not seem to be providing any additional control compared to the seed treatment alone. So our traditional recommendation of Poncho 1250 as a seed treatment for high pressure bill bug locations holds true. In lower pressure situations, it seems like the Poncho 500 is providing a benefit, as you see here. I want to transition now to stink bugs. I get a lot of questions about this every year, and we are a unique situation in North Carolina. Because we have lots of wheat acreage adjacent to corn, we oftentimes see problems in our corn due to stink bugs. These are some data from 2007 generated by my predecessor John Van Dyne and one of his students, Eric Blinka. And what they were interested in doing was monitoring the movement of stink bugs from wheat to corn. You can see that when you look at the number of stink bugs and sweeps from wheat, the solid black line here, you can see that there are a peak of adults in wheat and that they decrease into June once wheat is harvested. Focus your attention on the dotted black line. This is the peak of nymphs in wheat, and you notice that that peak follows the adults. So the adults move into wheat, lay eggs, that generation of nymphs develop. Now look at the blue line. Those are adults in corn. So those are stink bugs that are actually developing in wheat and migrating into corn. These data are from Georgia, and they show the population dynamics of brown stink bugs in corn, cotton, peanuts, and soybeans. And I've added wheat, since we have lots of wheat acreage in North Carolina, to modify this graph for our system. And so what I think happens is we have a peak of adults stink bugs in wheat that then move to corn, and then during the summer these stink bugs move throughout the system. They move among crops, corn, cotton, peanuts, soybeans, weeds, whatever is out there in the system, only moving into soybeans and developing another generation in the fall when weeds are beginning to dry down and many of our crops are harvested. One thing that's been done in the past is aerial insecticide applications for stink bugs in corn. These have generally been piggybacked with a fungicide and have just been kind of thrown in the tank hoping to manage stink bugs. We did a study in 2011 showing that these applications are not only generally ineffective to kill stink bugs, but they're not doing much to impact yield as well, because they're likely too late to do any good. And I'm going to discuss that a little bit more in detail. I think there are ways that aerial insecticide applications can be improved to kill stink bugs, and that's something that we're hopefully going to look into in the future. But generally when you piggyback a fungicide and it's targeted at the tassel stage of corn to control diseases, you're not going to kill many stink bugs and you're not going to impact yield. One thing that we were interested in doing was documenting the actual movement of stink bugs from wheat to corn. Our questions were, how does that migration look and when does it take place? And knowing that could help us target our sprays in corn so that we can manage stink bugs, since we know that they move from wheat to corn. So we did what's called a marked recapture study. So we looked at stink bugs in wheat, we looked at stink bugs in corn, and we actually marked them in wheat and tracked them moving into corn. And these are the data that you see here. I want you to focus your attention on the left part of this graph up here, and that's the total number of stink bugs in wheat. On the right are the total number of stink bugs in corn. It's very simple. Basically, the darker the dots you see, the more stink bugs were there. The right graph shows the total adult stink bugs. So you can look at the total stink bugs on the left, the total adult stink bugs on the right. You can see that there are darker circles on the left compared to the right, so a lot of that proportion in the wheat is actually nymph stink bugs. This is prior to wheat harvest. Then we just chose to focus our attention on the corn since the wheat was going to be harvested. You notice that there's not many stink bugs in corn just prior to wheat harvest. Now I'm going to move through these graphs very quickly because what I want you to do is I want you to track the dots and see how the stink bugs grow in the corn. So now we're looking at 2 days post wheat harvest, and we're noticing some of those circles starting to darken, and those are actually stink bugs that are moving from the wheat into the corn. Here the circles become much darker, and they're generally located on the edge. This is 4 days following the wheat harvest, and you notice that there's a lot of those dark circles there on total stink bugs, and they're not quite as dark when we look at adult stink bugs because that's actually nymphs that crawled from the wheat after it was harvested into the corn. 6 days after the wheat harvest, they start to move within the field. They're still much heavier on the edge. And then 8 days following the wheat harvest, the story is very similar. Stink bugs are easy to kill in corn if you make the right application. This was a study that was done in the same field as the marking experiment, and we put our insecticides out with a high boy. What I want you to focus on is not necessarily the types of insecticides. We had some different types of pyrethroids out there, some premixed products, and untreated plots as well. What I want you to focus your attention on is how well these insecticides worked and how long they work. So you notice that 1 day after treatment, we had about 0.2 stink bugs per plant in our untreated plots, and any insecticide we used was able to control those stink bugs. By the time we got to 7 days after treatment, the numbers in the untreated had grown from 0.2 stink bugs to 0.8 stink bugs per plant. And that's because those nymphs and adults had actually moved from the wheat into corn and were increasing. And our insecticides, again, all seem to work the same. That's because we put it out with the high boy. 14 days after treatment, we didn't see any difference among any of the treatments. So I think it's important to note that our insecticide applications can work, but they have to be targeted correctly, and we have to put them on at the optimal time. That is to say, when most of the stink bugs have moved into the corn, but before they've been there too long to do much damage. If we put those applications on too early, we're going to be targeting stink bugs before they arrive, and then our treatments are going to fail. So, summing up stink bug management, I think it's important that you check your wheat adjacent to corn for stink bugs. You need to pay attention to stink bug species. The 2 stink bug species that you're going to find in wheat are the brown stink bug and the rice stink bug. I've shown the brown stink bug in these photos here. Here's a picture of the brown stink bug nymph. Here's a picture of the brown stink bug adult. This is the stink bug pest that's going to move from wheat into corn. You'll also notice that some fields have a lot of this stink bug species here. This is called the rice stink bug. Now this is very prevalent in wheat, but it does not move much into corn, and in addition it does not feed on corn. So if you notice a lot of these guys here, don't be worried. They're not going to move into your corn. What do we need to look for in terms of numbers? Well, we did a survey in 2011 of 120 North Carolina and Virginia fields, and we found about 1.9 stink bugs per 20 sweeps at the peak infestation. So those numbers varied anywhere from, say, half a stink bug in 20 sweeps a few weeks earlier to almost 2 per 20 when the infestation was peak. Remember how those numbers grow in wheat. What I think you need to watch for is when you have 5 or more brown stink bugs in 20 sweeps. Now, I think that's important to watch. I don't think those densities are high, and we're not even sure what that means in terms of movement. We don't know if they're going to move from the wheat to the corn or not. And that's because the status of the weeds in adjoining ditches is very important. Remember back to earlier in the presentation when I said that stink bugs will move in the middle of the season throughout crops and even into weeds. Well, the same thing happens early season. This is a picture of our mark recapture study in 2010. You notice that our wheat here on the left and our corn that's adjacent to it on the right. And notice that there aren't too many weeds in that ditch and it's very dry. And this year the stink bugs moved very readily from the wheat into the corn, and that's when those nymphs crawled from the wheat into the corn. In 2011 the situation was a little different, but not very different. Notice that the field setup looks very similar, but that there are more weeds in the ditch between the wheat and the corn. This year was much wetter. Once the wheat was harvested, in the stubble we found around 0.2 stink bugs per square meter in that wheat stubble, over 2 stink bugs per square meter in the weeds in the ditch and hardly any stink bugs in the corn. And those stink bugs held in the ditch the entire time. Once the wheat was harvested, they did not move into corn and they stayed into the ditch. So that's why it's so important that you watch stink bugs in your wheat and you make sure that they're actually moving into your corn before you make a spray. Georgia does have some thresholds, and I think they're really good rules of thumb for us to follow. Prior to tasseling, I think it's good to spray if you see maybe 25% infested plants in your corn. The reason why you want to do that is we want to prevent situations like this from happening. Prior to tasseling, when the corn is pushing out that ear so that it'll be receptive to receive the pollen from the tassel, the ear has not yet developed. It's very early in formation, and any sort of stink bug piercing can arrest that development and result in huge deformations in the ear. At R1, once the ear is already pushed out, it's forming kernels and it's pollinating, and stink bug injury can interfere with that pollination and cause kernel loss. So we bump our threshold up to 50% infested plants because we can tolerate more of those losses compared to losing the entire ear. And then at R3, once it's pollinated, we say when you have 100% infested plants, it's probably a good idea to spray, because what the insect is doing is actually piercing the individual kernels, interfering with development and influencing aflatoxin levels. Very important when you do your scouting that you walk into the field. Think back to those mark recapture studies where most of those stink bugs were confined actually to the outer row of the corn. You need to walk into your field interior, perhaps consider some border sprays, and realize that most of those problems that you are going to see are on the field edge. There's some really good work coming out of Georgia showing that most of the problems that we see with aflatoxin are actually confined to that field edge, and some of that has to do with stress due to abiotic factors, things like weather, dryness, but also due to the fact that a lot of insects are just confined to the edges of fields. And if you're going to make a spray, it's probably best to make that spray about a week after the adjacent wheat harvest. And that's because we need to allow time for those stink bugs to move into corn. We don't want to spray too early before they've moved in there and then have to go in and spray again. You can email me with any questions at ddreisig@ncsu.edu. Thank you.